Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. This evening was no different. My mother was sitting at the table, as usual, with a bottle of whiskey on the table. That was the way the neighbors often paid for the chores in the vegetable garden. Mother could not only gather crops and weed, but also cut down trees and dig up the earth. Sometimes they gave money, but more often whiskey and something to eat. Evelyn knew how the evening might end, so she sat quietly with her brother Charles on her bed in the corner of the only room in the small hut. At 14, she had already seen a lot and remembered longingly the time when her own father Peter had been alive. Although her mother blamed him for all her misfortunes, he was 5 years older than her mother when he had just returned from the army. So all the girls didn't give him a pass. He immediately became the first guy in the village, tall, broad-shouldered, with a proud look in his piercing eyes. He spotted Molly at once, and she couldn't resist. She went along with her first feeling. Fool was so said his mother herself was quite drunk. She bought the presents, pretty words about love. And what did she almost get in Podol? That's how she recalled the accidental pregnancy that her own mother kicked her out of the house. Then she had to go to Peter, where she suffered humiliation from her future mother-in-law. She did not immediately allow her son to marry the girl he had spoiled and knocked up. Evelyn also learned this from her mother's drunken stories. So the birth of her daughter did not bring happiness to her mother. The girl felt that she had never loved her. And Evelyn herself remembered something else. Life in the big house that her father had built, his attention, kindness, affection. However, it all went only to her father's favorite, and her mother received more and more reproaches, insults from her husband. But while Evelyn was young, she did not understand what was going on in the family, and she was simply drawn to her father, who did not want her, unlike her mother. She could yell and slap me on the soft spot when my father wasn't around. Peter, an old man, used to call little Evelyn, who was told she looked just like her father. He himself often raised his hand to his wife, and if he thought she had done something wrong, then he would take his daughter in his arms and go with her to the store where he bought sweets. Such a life seemed either the most ordinary or the most ordinary. She didn't think about her mother's life. And what could a little girl who had been in such an environment since birth think about? It was familiar. She didn't know any other family routine. Only it all ended in a great tragedy. Olya was 6 years old when a fire broke out in their house. She was sound asleep in her room and did not hear her parents arguing. Her mother later said that her father beat her, so she could not bear her daughter, who almost died. If not for a neighbor, he risked his life to get into the house through a broken window and took the girl outside. The house burned to the ground. No one ever saw the father outside. He remained in the burning building. The mother said he was drunk and that he caused the fire. No one bothered to look into it. Then they found what was left of my father on the ashes and buried him alive in a closed coffin. Evelyn was not at the funeral. She went to the burn unit of the hospital, where she was taken by ambulance. The fire had managed to touch the left side of her face, leaving ugly marks. Her mother informed her that her father had died indifferently and casually, as if she were talking about the death of a distant relative with whom we were not really acquainted. The girl could not believe at first, and then get used to the fact that Daddy was gone. She felt the fullness of the misfortune that befell her when her mother picked her up after she was discharged from the hospital. From the bus stop, they walked across the village to the unfamiliar street where Evelyn's grandmother on her mother's side had once lived. Her low hut became the new home of the firefighters. In the fall, Evelyn started first grade. She had a hard time among her peers. Everyone drew attention to the ugly scar on her face from the burn. Teased, called names. She had to fight for her place in an unfriendly group of children. She'd never been what you'd call quiet. And now she had to be defiant, to stop insults and even fight. A fragile constitution is not a handicap, and if you have a strong spirit inside, and no one to stand up for you. Her mother told her at once that she was not going to defend her. She was still strict and cold with her daughter. But the worst thing was that everyone around her was talking about her mother. Molly, they said, had absent-mindedly walked out on her husband with the chairman of the collective farm, for whom she was a secretary, for which she was beaten by her jealous husband. And Evelyn's father was pitied for dying so absurdly, and her mother was blamed for it. Oldie often stayed at the hut when her mother said she was going away on business. She came back late at night, and in the morning she reeked of booze. One fall her mother said that soon they would move to a new house, that their life would be different, and that her stepfather would appear. But that didn't happen. One day her mother appeared on the doorstep in tears, cursing someone with the last words, from which the girl understood only that the chairman of the collective farm had been imprisoned, and her mother was threatened with dismissal. 6 months later, Evelyn had a brother, Charles. She had just finished first grade. Grandmother Wendy, Peter's mother, promised to take the girl to her house for the summer and in the village to pick on her mother, saying that she took the child away from the chairman, who is now serving time for stealing from her. Evelyn spent the vacations at her grandmother's good quality house. She didn't want to go back to her mother's house, and Grandma Wendy assured her that she would persuade her daughter-in-law to give her her granddaughter, especially since she now had a son, Charles, and it seemed even her mother was okay with that. And in those 3 months she had not visited her daughter once, only on the last day of summer. Wendy's grandmother died suddenly. Evelyn returned to her mother immediately after the funeral because no one else in her father's family cared about her. They all had their own families and their own children. In the little mother wants with the baby to move his and Olenbed's crib, as well as a stroller, she did not have. For the girl herself, they put a wide bench on which she could sleep. We had changed so much in those months. She had changed from a beautiful young woman to an unpleasant aunt with unwashed hair and a dirty housecoat. She breastfed her baby and often fell asleep with him, not only at night, but also during the day. Many household chores immediately fell on Evelyn's shoulder. She would buy groceries at the store after school and lug home not only her briefcase, but also a large bag. Her mother could make some soup for her when she came home. But on occasion, the girl herself would get to the stove in the tiny kitchen as soon as she was home. Evelyn did laundry, cleaned, stoked the stove, fetched water from the well. Her mother only took care of her brother, and sometimes, dressed in her only pretty dress and by the hair in her frame, she left the house, leaving the baby with Evelyn. Fortunately, Charles grew up a very quiet child, and the girl did fine with him. Even managed to do her homework while playing school with her brother. She read him the given paragraph and conditions. Tasks many times, she repeated the rules from a line of poems. She did not manage to make friends in the neighborhood. And at school, she was more afraid of her tough temper, and nobody wanted to be her friends. So her little brother replaced Evelyn's friends, and her mother's absence was more joyful than distressing. With Charles, the two of them got along just fine. The girl could dress the baby and feed him. It happened that they fell asleep together. And returning at night, the mother lay down on the bench. When the summer vacations began, Mother began to leave home more often, sometimes even overnight. Then she brought groceries and left again. Evelyn, she did not explain her absence in any way. But the girl heard unpleasant conversations from the neighbors about her mother. They called her a whore, and that was the most decent thing a daughter could hear. Sometimes one of the neighbors would come to their hut, where Evelyn tried to keep order, bring them something to eat. One neighbor gave them an old cot, and now Evelyn could walk with her brother without having to carry him in her arms. Walking with the baby in the stroller was more fun than sitting in four walls, if it were not for the idle talk of the mother of all the encountered villagers, if it were not for their sympathy for the prying eyes, which became uncomfortable. By the fall, Mother seemed to pull herself together and said that she had found a job in the district center. She got Charles into nursery school, and life for their little family somehow got better. Evelyn was doing well in school. Classmates no longer paid such close attention to her ugly scar on her cheek, and as the girl grew, it began to seem smaller, and part of her cheek managed to cover the dark hair, which set just above her shoulders. Her mother returned home late on the last bus from the district center, so Evelyn often picked up her brother from the nursery herself. She still did the housework. Her mother said it was her responsibility because she was earning her own money. Only they were always in short supply. The girl was used to wearing clothes that neighbors, acquaintances, and strangers gave her brother in rags. And her mother could not afford new clothes. Only one day everything changed. Molly came home with a pleasant fragrance, in a new dress and high-heeled shoes, and she declared that now their lives would definitely change, and they would move to the district center from this miserable village. She brought a bag of food that Evelyn could only dream of. It was a real feast, especially noticeable after the nasty soup and pasta of their family's usual diet. In fact, the summer Evelyn graduated from the 4th grade, they moved to the county seat and stayed with Uncle Stephen, a friend of Mom's as she called him, in a big house with a balcony, a terrace, and a pool in the yard. Evelyn and her brother got one of the rooms on the 2nd floor, but now they each had their own bed, their own table, and lots of toys. Uncle Stephen, a middle-aged man with a prominent belly that barely tightened his crimson jacket, was much older than his mother. There were often noisy parties at his house, during which Evelyn and her brother had to sit in their room and keep their heads down while there were guests in the house. But they were allowed to watch as much cable as they wanted. During the day, when no one was home, Evelyn and her brother could walk around the house and even swim in the pool. But with Uncle Stephen's arrival, their mother took them back to their assigned room. She herself did not work now, nor did she do chores at home. Uncle Stephen had a cook, a maid, and a gardener. Mother was very transformed. She dyed her hair blonde and changed her dress and shoes every day. Uncle Stephen bought her a car and she learned to drive. As the school year began, she began driving Evelyn to school and Charles to kindergarten. Now Evelyn and her brother were dressed to perfection, and her mother started talking about plastic surgery to remove the ugly scar from her daughter's face. At her new school, her classmates were kind to her, and her teachers were almost dusting her off. Uncle Stephen was hailed as a sponsor. Immediately, there were girlfriends and friends who enjoyed spending time with Evelyn, spending her pocket money. And Uncle Stephen was not stingy on that. The carefree life did not last long. One day, Mom picked Evelyn up from school. They were making plans for the weekend when, as they drove up to Uncle Stephen's house, they saw a big man dressed in dark clothes. He jumped out of the gate, hurriedly got into a big expensive car, and immediately accelerated around the corner. Mother and Evelyn, overcome with fear, entered the house. Uncle Stephen was lying on the carpet in the living room, the wound on his head bleeding a dark liquid onto the white floor. The mother screamed so loudly that Evelyn clamped her hands over her ears. That same day, as Uncle Stephen's body was taken to the morgue, his legal wife arrived. As stated by the full woman, who was much older than her mother and ordered her out of the house with her brats. That's what she called Evelyn and her brother. And the girl and her mother and brother found themselves back in the village in the very manna hut from which they had previously thought they had left for good. The mother alone drank almost a bottle of expensive brandy and fell asleep right at the table. While Evelyn was reading a story to her brother before going to bed, very quickly Mother was selling off her beautiful things and jewelry. The turn came to the car. The family managed to get by on the proceeds for several months. During this time, my mother gave up a lot. Every day she was no longer drinking expensive cognac, but ordinary whiskey, for which she exchanged the rest of her beautiful things. Occasionally, some new men she knew would keep her company. It happened that one of them would stay the night, falling asleep on the floor or on the old couch that had replaced the broad bench. When Evelyn once asked one of her mother's drinking companions to leave, he punched her in the face and hurled her away from him so that the girl hit the wall. Charles woke up and rushed to his sister. Apparently, that was the only thing that stopped the drinking buddy from further reprisals. So he went outside, cursing foully. The mother cried in the morning, begged the children's forgiveness, and promised that it would never happen again. And indeed, for a while she stopped drinking. I looked for a job, or at least a part-time job, but I couldn't find anything permanent. When the money ran out, my mother began to take on any household chores. It happened that they paid with food, and then with alcohol. And mother started drinking again, this time alone. And then it was better not to get in her face or under her arm. Now mother literally assured the willful in herself shot after shot. Charles would cry out in fright, and his mother would grab whatever was at hand and try to hit him, demanding that he shut up. The first time, he got it hard. It was enough to hit him once with the mop before Evelyn got between them and his brother. It hit her too. But then she was able to wrestle the implement away from her mother, after which she swept and poured with drunken tears. After that incident, Evelyn, examining the snow on her brother's arm, sternly punished him never to cry in front of his mother. Her own bruises and abrasions she just didn't pay attention to. So, they would pass. But now, as her mother began her usual whiskey infusion, the girl was on her guard, expecting a beating. Evelyn knew how this ordinary evening for them might end, so she sat quietly with her pen on her bed in the corner of the only room in the little hut, which she already hated with all her soul, as well as her own mother. She cast an occasional glance at her, trying to see which way the pendulum would swing this time, her mood. And sometimes the mother could fall asleep without touching the children. Just not this time, which of course, a mother would have. Suddenly she yelled, when the bottle was already empty. The girl had no time to answer. The mother got up quickly, grabbed her work overalls, which had been given to her by one of the neighbors, and began to whip it over her daughter's body. "Because of you and your father, my whole life has been derailed," she yelled, and the iron buckles and overalls hurt her skin with each blow. Evelyn tried to cover her face with her hands, but when the pain pierced her arm too hard and blood spurted from the wound, the hand fell limply, and the blow struck her face. Evelyn could not hold back her sobs of pain and resentment, but immediately lunged at her mother with her fists, poking her as hard as she could in her mother's stomach and settling on the floor. The girl grabbed her brother in an armful and rushed out of the hut, not noticing the blood pouring into her face. Under the dark, deserted street, the children ran to their uncle's house, who had once saved them in a fire. His wife treated the girl's wounds, cursing the negligent mother, and he himself immediately left. Charles was asleep, and Evelyn could not sleep a wink. When her uncle returned and told her that their mother had died, that the police had already been to their hut, and that tomorrow they would be taken to an orphanage, Evelyn could not understand her feelings. Her mother's death did not seem like grief to her, but of deliverance from eternal fear and beatings. But had that clumsy blow she had taken to her mother's stomach caused her death? It was I who killed her. Did the girl ask the worried question to the woman in the police uniform when she and her brother were being taken by car to the district center the next day? No, of course. She assured me that the whiskey killed your mother, and you'll be all right. She tried to smile, complained to the school, and patted Charles on the head. The brother and sister spent a month in the orphanage. September was approaching. Ola was about to go to 8th grade, and Charles was in 1st grade. In those days, the issue of their transfer to the orphanage was being decided. But one day, Evelyn overheard a conversation between the teacher and the director. "This is a good chance for the boy," said the educator of a wealthy family. "Our regular sponsors can only dream of such a thing. They like Charles. He's a handsome and bright boy. Only he will have to part with his sister." Carefully, the principal remarked, "They are not planning to take the girl away, are they?" "No, just Charles. You know, Evelyn's 14 now. It's a difficult age. No one wants to get themselves in trouble." Yes, and her face was badly damaged, thanks to her dead mother's grief. There's a burn scar and an eyebrow, but it's her character that's worse. She's a feisty little girl. She had to survive in hard conditions, the headmaster interrupted. But she stands up for her brother, and he does not take one step away from her. Maybe he won't agree to part with her. It would be a pity if he did. A new family will open up a whole new horizon for the boy. The adoptive parents are going to move abroad. Their business is booming. They have much to give Charles, will change his fate. Evelyn, before this dutiful conversation, had never thought of the possibility that she might be separated from her brother. He was the only family man for the girl, whom she loved dearly. She understood who the caretaker principals were talking about. Several times an older couple came to the orphanage. In a large, expensive car, they were welcomed with open arms. They brought gifts for the children and were the guests of honor at the concert of the children. Apparently, they liked Charles immediately. They clapped enthusiastically when he recited a poem he had learned with Evelyn. Then they gave him a stuffed toy bear. Charles named it Stompy and now slept with it. And Evelyn made sure that none of the other children took it away. So they want to take his brother. This wee with pain pierced the girl's heart. Of course, no one wants her herself. Unattractive because of the scars. And cocky, because otherwise she couldn't survive on her own and protect her brother. If Evelyn wanted to, she'd set her brother up so he'd never agree to part with her. They won't take him away by force. They will stay together in the orphanage until Evelyn turns 18. Then she can become his guardian. Then they won't have to grow up apart, but only the caregiver is right. Charles gets a lucky ticket to a better life. If he is taken into their family by these rich people, he will have everything he could ever dream of. How could Evelyn deny him that chance? She laid awake all night, wondering how she would live without her brother. Bitter tears rolled down her cheeks. There were so many that by morning her pillow was wet. But she made the only right decision. Charles, you want to be adopted by the people who gave you the toy, she told her brother. In the morning they will take me away with them. Frightened, the boy asked, Yes, you will live with them. And you? He looked anxiously into her eyes. And I will stay here. Evelyn said it in a way that her voice did not waver. But I don't want to go anywhere without you. You can live with them, too. They will only take you. Evelyn felt a traitorous lump in her throat, but she immediately took a deep breath and said confidently, When we grow up, we'll find each other and we can live together again. She smiled. Charles drove off in a big, beautiful car into his new life, cuddling a toy bear. And Evelyn stood at the window, no longer holding back tears. Her brother was lucky, but she was not. And Evelyn would have to fight for a place in the sun from this day on alone. Charles woke up in a bad mood. Late last night, he had been checking the reports of his subordinates, taking notes on what could improve things at his bank to beat the competition. In his 30s, he had the kind of wealth that the average person dreams of and more. But he wasn't happy with real estate in his historic homeland abroad, or a collection of cars in his garage, or solid sums in his bank accounts, or profits from shares in large companies. He inherited all this from his deceased parents and made no effort to do so. He was already tired of being seen by everyone around him as a spoiled young man who, in fact, could do nothing but use his parents' money himself. Then he opened his own bank in order to prove to himself and others that he was capable of becoming a successful banker. Yes, he used his inherited capital for this purpose, but the prosperity of his own business depended solely on him and his team, and he worked hard to get his bank to the top of the rankings. Only so far, it wasn't working out so well. Yesterday, when he looked at the reports, he was very angry because he saw very different figures than he had planned after several years of bank operations. Already after midnight, he threw all the papers on the table in his office, and the next morning he was going to continue his work. In a large house designed by a famous architect. 5 years ago, he lived alone. The cleaning was done by an assistant who came in, and the gardener tended to the grounds. Charles took a quick shower, went to the dressing room, and selected his clothes, a white shirt and a dark blue suit with barely visible stripes. The ties, the pins to them were lying there neatly folded in a nice box. He tied the tie in a knot, as his father had taught him. He put on his shoes, clean to a shine, which he'd already worn a little, casting a satisfied look at the 2 rows of new shoes. Today he got to try out the sneakers at the gym. He'd taken them out of the box the other day, but that would be tonight. In the meantime, He had to hurry to the office to finally get the paperwork done, and then gather some helpers to come up with a new plan that would make his business more efficient. There were several expensive cars parked in Charles' garage. He chose the one he usually drove around town, expensive and presentable. He got behind the wheel himself and drove out the gate. He regretted a little that he had only had water and lemon this morning, and decided to postpone coffee until the office. The home coffee machine seemed to him to make better drinks than the office one, even though they were both pretty much the same. Charles arrived early in the workday. What's the big deal? The security guard was surprised. He got up hurriedly to greet his boss at the office, still not done with his cleaning job. But Charles noted with satisfaction that she had already managed to clean up his office. The secretary wasn't there yet, so he had to pour his own coffee and quietly wield a mop in the office kitchen. She had been hired a few days before. The personnel manager said she was barely 18. She had just entered some college. Her father is disabled and her mother works in a factory. It was obvious that she did not have enough money. The girl had to take the job. And the salary in the Charles Bank, even as a cleaner, is not bad. The girl, despite her young age, had already managed to work for the company for a month. So she had some experience in cleaning. The security check, as reported to the owner, she passed successfully. Charles nodded her greeting, poured coffee into a cup, and headed to his office. He spread out the papers he'd left on the desk before he left the night before, but didn't notice the notes he'd made on the individual sheets. He thought those sketches would be useful. Where had he put them? Charles started looking for his notes and almost knocked over his coffee cup right on the paper. Damn it. He cursed when he couldn't find several sheets of paper. Had the cleaning lady thrown them away? But why? He tried to remember her name to call out and ask Jenna. Roman shouted after the girl who was leaving. She turned around and he waved to her, inviting her into his office. "My name is Cindy," the cleaning lady said, approaching him. "What can I do for you?" "Have you been cleaning my desk?" Charles asked irritably. "I can't find a few pieces of paper with important notes on them." "I threw the paper away," the girl answered simply. "Why did you do that?" Charles was indignant. There were important notes there, and I really needed them. If they were important, why did you crumple them? "I thought they were garbage, so I threw them away." "Don't you dare touch anything on my desk." Charles got angry. "How am I supposed to clean up without touching anything on your desk?" Cindy got indignant. It was a dump this morning. Charles didn't really have the energy to throw the leftovers he'd ordered for himself in the basket in the middle of the night at the Chinese restaurant. And there seemed to be a lot of extra food on his table from this morning. But in any case, how dare that girl janitor rebuke him, and in such an impertinent tone. It takes just a little intelligence to distinguish the trash of daring records. The bank owner exclaimed angrily, "But you must have a problem with your intelligence. Find me those risks, urgently offer to pick through the garbage." Surprised the janitor. "Yes, since you haven't figured out not to throw away anything that might come in handy." Cindy walked out of the office, and Charles became all pissed off inside. How impertinent. How dare she talk to him like that? In his mind, he was indignant. Charles had not yet had time to drink his coffee and calm down. When the cleaner returned in her hands was a box of Chinese noodles, which she placed right in front of his nose. "Here are the papers I collected from your desk," the girl declared. "Do you want me to get them, or should I do it myself? Are you making fun of me?" The banker was indignant. "Take it out." The girl wrinkled her nose and pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper, scribbled hastily in Charles' handwriting. The paper was stained with sauce and touched with her hands. There was no way Charles himself wanted to. As he unfolded the piece of paper, he commanded, "You have gloved hands, and I do not." Cindy unfolded the paper. Charles ran his eyes over the page and realized that there was nothing important on the paper. Would it make sense to take the other pieces of paper out of the box? It would be better to try to think it over again. "Can you throw it away?" He glanced at the girl, who only poked. And in response, he took the sheet with 2 fingers and shoved it back into the noodle box. It's too squeamish for the cleaners. Charles nodded mockingly at the girl as she walked away. She immediately turned around and walked back to his desk. She gave him a fearsome look. "Who gave you the right to speak to me like that?" She was indignant. "Do you think that because you have a lot of money, you are allowed to make fun of people who are less fortunate in life?" Charles was taken aback for a moment, but then he pulled himself together. "And who gave you the right to yell at me?" he asked angrily. "Every cricket knows his own business. I own the bank, and you work for me, and your work is simple and does not require a lot of hard thinking, but you're not very good at it. I'm great at cleaning offices, but pigs like you are incapable of separating the trash of daring papers on your own desk, and that's not my problem. But that's overkill. You and I won't work out." Blushing with anger, Charles declared, "Write a letter of resignation." Why was he even having this conversation with the cleaning lady? He thought as the girl left, slamming the door. She had only done her job. But for some reason she was so defiant. What kind of impertinence? But these thoughts quickly gave way to others. He needed to prepare for a meeting to brainstorm with his subordinates to promote the bank among a sea of competitors. For several hours he again put his thoughts down, writing them in a notebook rather than on separate sheets of paper. After all, the girl had taught him something. Charles grinned again, involuntarily remembering her. And when the secretary brought the papers to sign, at first he put the letter of resignation of the cleaning lady aside, as if he did not dare to put his resolution. But a little later he did sign it. The meeting went better than he had expected, and now his first assistants could get to work on the plan. But the opportunity to breathe out presented itself. He was contemplating how best to spend the evening, to invite an old girlfriend to a restaurant, or accept the invitation of friends and go to a country club, when the security guard called him. "Charles, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's a very scandalous woman here to see you. I said you don't have a private reception. I wanted to send her to the right branch of the bank, but she won't say what the purpose of her visit is. She just keeps saying she wants the owner of the bank." "Tom, you're right. I don't want any scandalized women in my house. Do you walk her out, or do you want her to tell you what she's unhappy about?" "Then to the right specialist," ordered Charles. It wasn't often that he was personally approached by bank customers, and he certainly could not recall a scandal about being dissatisfied. Specialist promptly resolved all conflicts that arise without his involvement. He had less than half an hour left until the end of the day. He finally got through to Helen, with whom he had arranged to meet in 2 hours at an expensive restaurant, and decided that he could afford to leave a little earlier to go home and change. His relationship with Nancy remained uncertain, and she was anxious to attain the status of not just a girlfriend, but a girl with whom Charles was in a serious relationship, and even better would be a fiancé. But he was not ready for the former, much less the latter, maintaining only a friendship for now. And that meant that from time to time they met, exchanged news, and just chatted in a pleasant place. And sometimes, if he needed a date to an event, he would suggest that Nancy go with him. A beautiful, well-groomed girl, an undeniable plus to his image as a young banker. In addition, she herself is from the same circle as he is the sole heiress to the owner of the hotel chain. Charles' parents would have approved of his choice, but they were no longer alive. A year ago, his father passed away suddenly, and a month later his mother passed away. They lived permanently in their mansion in Italy. The father worked until his last day, distributing his assets. The direct heir was Charles. But part of the inheritance by his father's decision went to Frank, the son of his father's late sister, who after her death was left in the care of his uncle. Charles's relationship with Frank did not work out from the beginning, all because his parents adopted Charles when he was 7 years old. Frank's mother was never married, and her brother Andrew always took care of her and her nephew, and took care of them. She hoped that her son would be the only heir who never had children of his own. Andrew was 45, as was his wife when they decided to adopt. When they saw Roman at the orphanage, they had long helped children without parental care. They often visited orphanages, but they were in no hurry to adopt until they saw Charles. The foster mother often told the boy later that he had fallen in love from the very first meeting. And then she and her husband made up their minds, although the move did not find approval from Andrew's sister. Puppy Begotten had teased Frank Charles as a child, but Charles did not complain to his foster parents and tried to punish the offender himself. Frank, on the other hand, despite being a year younger than Charles, always had a sturdier build and always came out the winner in their scuffles. After high school, both young men studied at prestigious foreign universities. They only met during vacations at their parents' home, and those meetings could not be called warm. Although Andrew dreamed of their friendship, Frank, after the death of his uncle, had hoped for more than he got in the end, and this further exasperated Charles. He made no secret of his jealousy of the unborn. He was just lucky enough to be a member of the family, even though he was not a blood relative. Frank failed to develop his business, built on his uncle's money, then sold it, and in a fairly short period of time wasted most of the inheritance received. Now he lived off the proceeds of the remaining unsold stock. Sometimes he approached Charles, cleverly manipulating his feelings to get financial help. Charles was perfectly aware of what was going on, but out of guilt, always gave Frank the money. He actually thought he had a point, calling him a stray puppy. Had his parents not adopted Charles 23 years ago, he would not now have a multi-million-dollar inheritance or his own banking business. He didn't have fond memories of his early childhood, of his alcoholic mother, of how he didn't have a sweet life for the first 7 years of his life. The only bright person he kept memories of was his older sister, Evelyn, who had cared for him during those years. It was she who persuaded his brother to agree, to leave with his foster parents. One thing Charles always regretted. His foster father and mother took him in alone, and they could have adopted his sister, but they didn't want to. Evelyn had told Charles when they parted that they would surely meet when they grew up, and he tried especially hard to find his sister when he returned from overseas after his adoptive parents died. And then he started his own banking business. But in all those years, he could find no trace of his sister. The dilapidated house where they lived with their alcoholic mother, the sister had sold long ago, and no one knew where she had gone. Probably got married and changed her last name. Only Charles never gave up hope of finding her. Maybe that's why he was in no hurry to build a personal life. Was that it? Wouldn't have to wait until he resolved his unfinished family business. But they could still have dinner together tonight. So Charles made a reservation at their favorite restaurant. He just walked out of the building and headed for the parking lot, when a woman, whose age was difficult to tell because of her baggy clothes, approached him with a decisive step. Her face was framed by prominent dark hair, a scar on her cheek. But something in her eyes seemed very familiar to Charles. She said hello. He answered and paused, trying to see where he could see her. "They wouldn't let me into your office," she began. "I was actually too angry with you. I wanted to fight, but now I've cooled off a bit. And I just want to ask you not to fire my daughter Cindy. She got a job at your bank a few days ago as a janitor, but she lost her job today, as I understand from her story, because she behaved inappropriately with you. I apologize to you for my daughter's behavior." Charles listened to the woman and his face changed. He recognized her voice immediately. There was a lump in his throat, so he could not get a word out. "We have a very difficult life situation in our family," the woman continued. "My husband, Cindy's father, became disabled 6 months ago because of an accident at the factory where he worked. Now he can't walk, and it has already taken a lot of money to treat him. Cindy really wanted to study. She went to university. I worked 2 jobs, but we still can't make ends meet. A job at your bank needs my girl. Can you forgive her and let her work again?" "What is your name?" Charles asked. When did he finally regain the power of speech? Evelyn answered the woman in surprise. She probably hadn't expected that the bank owner would want to meet her. "Evelyn, I am your brother." Charles was left in no doubt that the older sister he had been looking for was in front of him. "Charles." Tears spurted from the woman's eyes. "Yes, it's me." Evelyn couldn't believe that her life could change so drastically. It had only been a month since she and her brother had met after 23 long years apart, and so many changes. She no longer had any hope of finding Charles. Their meeting happened only because Cindy's daughter had lost her job, barely getting a job in a bank as a cleaner, the owner of which happened to be her uncle. But now the girl can safely study without worrying about money. That's what Charles said. Yes, and the rest of Evelyn's problems, which had bought themselves since childhood, began to be solved. Her brother first bought her a large 3-bedroom apartment with designer renovations and full furnishings after a room in a communal apartment on the outskirts of Leh, where the family was squatting. Evelyn couldn't believe her luck. To live in such a place in an upscale neighborhood. At first, she hesitated to use the appliances in her new apartment for fear of breaking something. But Cindy quickly got the hang of it and then showed her mother how and what worked. Then her brother brought her to the Clinic of New Technologies, where she would soon have a plastic surgery and finally get rid of the scar on her face from the fire. The dissected eyebrow, which she hid with bangs and drooping over her eyes, is also to be corrected at the same clinic. Charles said that Evelyn could improve any part of her body here if she wished, but she laughingly declined such an offer. It was enough for her to have the scars removed from her face. Evelyn's husband was also being prepared for surgery. He had been injured on the job. He was working as a bricklayer for a private construction firm. He fell off a scaffold and injured his spine, but his bosses persuaded him to file a domestic injury, promising to pay for the surgery. He agreed, but never received any money, and the firm soon closed, and hope for recovery melted away like smoke. Everything changed after Charles offered his help. Now Evelyn's husband was undergoing the necessary examinations, and next, after the surgery, there was a chance that he would be able to walk again. A joyful smile never left Evelyn's face. All this month, her brother handed her his bank card, which had more than Evelyn's annual income from the 2 jobs where she had been working lately, and as promised by her brother, the card would be replenished monthly. The only thing that overshadowed the joy was that Cindy was not particularly warm to her uncle, unable to forget their quarrel over throwing the sheets of his notes in the trash and him forcing her to get them out. "Daughter, you should be more affectionate with Charles," Evelyn remarked, when her daughter visited her after surgery in the clinic, "but at least be more polite." "What? Look how much he's helping us. You don't have to work yourself. We're living in a real mansion now. You've bought yourself beautiful and fashionable things with his money." "Mom, I talked to him all right." "Your brother's a snob. He's arrogant. The man acts like he was born with all the good things in life. Or did he earn it all himself? He's made a fortune, and he's made a fortune out of the dirt. He owes it to you. That's why he's helping you." "What are you talking about?" Evelyn was indignant. "He does it from the bottom of his heart. More from guilt, from the fact that he was once more fortunate than you. But he owes it to you that he survived with your wretched mother. You raised him until he was 7, and he wouldn't have made it without you." "Cindy, you're wrong," Evelyn objected. "Yes, I took care of him in his early years, and he was really lucky to be in a good family with a lot of money. But any money can be wasted if you don't invest in your own business." Charles studied hard, and now he works hard. What's so important he does, this bank of his. Important business for the people. He's just a loan shark. He lends money to people at interest and makes a profit that way. He's luckier in this life than the others. But he didn't start any businesses that were engaged in any kind of production. He makes money out of money and nothing else. I don't believe my ears. Olga was taken aback by the daughter's words. "How ungrateful you are. Maybe, my brother, you think you owe something to me. But certainly not to you, my dear daughter. I'm sure he's doing charity work, just as his foster father and Charles used to say that the late Andrew invested in the company by buying stock. You don't know anything about it, but you're judging." This conversation with her daughter left a bitter residue in Evelyn's soul. She wished so much that the joy of finally being reunited with her brother could be shared by all her family. But the reality was different. When the swelling on her face was gone after the plastic surgery, she could finally see herself without the ugly scars. Evelyn cried when she looked in the mirror. It turns out she's so beautiful, without the burn marks and eyebrow dissection. Now she could get her hair out of her face too, instead of wearing uncomfortable bangs. She is wearing new clothes that she bought with her stylist. This sweet girl was asked to help Charles. Evelyn had a little eyeliner and lipstick. In a new suit and shoes with an updated face, she couldn't recognize her own reflection in the mirror. Yes, for summer, the sweater partly. She came to the clinic where her husband was being rehabilitated after surgery. He hadn't seen her in days, and she longed to hear from him how good she looked. Evelyn, is that it? Her husband looked at his wife, unable to hide his surprise. She was completely different, and instead of joy, she saw sadness on his face. Just that it was not. She asked in disappointment, "I love you with your scars because your soul is light. Though impertinent, you can be sometimes. And now you're so beautiful. Why do you need me? The doctors say that after this operation, I will soon be able to walk. But I don't really believe it. And the fact is, I'm on a miserable pension, and you're still so young and 40 years old, and your brother gave you so much. What are you talking about?" Evelyn asked me angrily. "Do you want to divorce me?" "I don't. I'm afraid you'll leave me now. It's too easy. That's what I am to you. Don't even think about it. We've been together since we were young. I hope to spend my old age with you. You just need to get used to me refreshed." Evelyn smiled and fixed her hair. Frank nervously smoked one cigarette after another, right in bed. He didn't feel like getting up. His head was buzzing after last night's party. And in the morning, he got a phone call reminding him of a card debt he had long forgotten about and now needed money, which meant he'd have to go to Charles again, that tramp puppy who'd inherited his uncle's inheritance, to grovel again to get his own. Frank was sure his uncle's adopted son had taken possession of the capital that by birthright belonged only to him. Too bad his uncle had decided otherwise. He said they were two brothers, though not by blood, but by the will of fate. He dreamed that Frank and Charles would someday be friends, that they would each open their own business. They would have children to carry on the family line. How naive was he in these dreams? At almost 30, Frank never knew what he wanted to do. What kind of work did he want to do? He tried once, but it didn't work out, and the last of his money was slipping through his fingers like water. He wanted to put it back into some business, but he couldn't think of one. Which one? The only thing left was stocks. My uncle was buying them for my mother. They made a yearly income, and there was no way to touch them. Otherwise, it would come to the point of selling the apartment my uncle had bought for him and his mother. When she was still alive, Frank now lived here alone. There was also an expensive car, but it was a bad idea to lose that too. So we'd have to go bow to the novel. With these thoughts, Frank put out his cigarette butt and got out of bed. In the mirror, his face was reflected in a rather wrinkled state. He should go over to barber's to trim the hair on his head and tidy his beard. And he hadn't been to the gym in almost a month. That way his muscles would quickly turn to fat with his lifestyle. Bogetter's figure needs physical exertion. From an early age, everyone told him that he looked very much like his native uncle, both in facial features and body build. It's a pity he didn't learn how to do business the way his late uncle did, and that was largely hampered by resentment. He was relegated to the margins of the family in preference to receiving. "What? Good to see you." Charles smiled good-naturedly as Frank entered his office. It was odd, since they never left, and every time they met, they ended up fighting. "I wanted to call you myself to invite you to a family dinner at the restaurant where we used to get together with my parents and your mother, but as if it was just you and me left of the family." Frank was surprised. "It's going to be a dinner for the two of us. And what's the occasion?" "You know, I want you to meet my own sister, whom we met after many years apart 3 months ago, and with her husband and daughter our family has grown larger." "It is your family that has grown larger." Frank sparkled his eyes, "and I have nothing to do with your relatives. Your uncle, my foster father, really wanted us to have a relationship. Quite calmly, Charles said. And I think we can. I want you to be part of my family and get to know my folks. I have no such desire, Frank declared. But then he came to his senses. He was going to ask Charles for money. And with that attitude, there would be no quarrel before he could state his request. Anyway, I'm free tonight. I'll be there. I'm glad you changed your mind. Charles gave Frank a friendly pat on the shoulder. I have another proposition for you. You know your father has invested in processing farms, and now there's an opportunity to buy some of them out if you want to go into that business. Dad would have offered it to you himself. I'm sure of it. Are you really going to do that for me? Frank looked at Charles incredulously. You put your money into this business. It is my father's money of your uncle, and you have the right to use it, but only for business. What if I can't do it? Confused, Frank asked. I have faith in you. I need you to believe. Take responsibility. Then everything will work out. But if there are difficulties, we can solve them together. Frank walked out of Charles' office feeling confused. He had not expected such generosity and such grand gestures from this man. He tried to look for a catch, but he couldn't. And he received the money to close the debt from him easily, without the humiliation he had been preparing for all morning. And he heard not a word of reproach, but only the hope that Frank would become the responsible owner of the business. And he had promised it to his brother, whom he now had no use for calling a stray puppy. His offer was too noble. An hour later, Charles called him and informed him that the dinner would not be at the restaurant, but at his sister's apartment. At her request, she wanted to cook dinner for the expensive guests herself and not to spend extra money, which of course she kept silent, but she meant it. That was exactly the kind of guest Frank felt when he crossed the threshold of Evelyn's apartment. We can dispense with the ceremonies. Can I call you brother? She asked. Frank, smiling broadly. He was taken aback, but nodded eagerly. That's good, dear brother. It's a pleasure to meet you. I cooked dinner with love. I wanted very much to please you and Charles. And Evelyn was bustling to get Frank to the table, and he couldn't take his eyes off the landlady's daughter. Cindy, he was told, a freshman student, looked flawless even to his sophisticated eye. There were all kinds of beauty swirling around him. And this girl was so natural, beautiful, well-built, obviously like her mother. So he was like a child to her, but there was no blood kinship between them. So, Frank didn't have time to continue this thought because everyone was already seated at the table, and Charles raised his hand with the cognac, about to make a toast. He talked about how happy he was to be together with the people dearest to him. He spoke kindly of his foster parents, to whom he owed all the blessings of life. But he was especially grateful to his sister for raising him in his early years, and she was the one who insisted that he agree to become part of the family. Evelyn could not hold back her tears, and Frank himself found those words very touching. That night, he really felt like a family member to these people, who were complete strangers to him. So warm, caring, and attentive to him that he had not received so much warmth, care, and attention for a long time. He was not a stranger here. Nancy looked fondly at the sleeping baby. Andrew's son was only a few days old, but she already felt confident in her role as a mother. A year ago, Charles had finally asked her to marry him when she had never expected to hear it. The day Charles finally found his own sister, whom he had studied with in his early childhood, he didn't explain anything. Nancy only canceled them already because of a sudden change of plans. Then she took offense and left for Bali without saying a word to him. She didn't return his phone calls and tried to forget him, but she couldn't. And when she returned 4 months later, she found out about a big change in his life. Not only had he reunited with his sister, met her husband and daughter, but he had also developed a relationship with his cousin Frank, with whom they had only had one disagreement in life. When Nancy met Evelyn herself, she realized how lucky Charles was. She liked his sister so much. Endlessly open-minded, friendly, though sometimes overly direct. She was the one who, after talking to Nancy for a while, immediately set about arranging her and Charles' relationship. "I don't believe in any friendship between a man and a woman," she said confidently. "Since you've known each other for so long and continue to date, your relationship just needs some development. It should be pushed to a decisive step. I've noticed the way he looks at you, so if you have a feeling for him, you can heat it up. I'll tell you how to proceed." Nancy couldn't believe it. What would ever listen to advice? A little-known person about how to seduce a man. But even that advice actually proved to work. And soon Charles himself was looking for a meeting with her, and then in a very romantic atmosphere offered to be his wife. Became friends with Evelyn and his niece Cindy, a very nice girl. Charles told with a smile the quarrel with which their acquaintance began, and how it was not easy for him to win the girl's favor afterwards. Strange as it may seem, it was Frank who helped him. It was he who told Cindy at the first family dinner together about his brother's proposal to go into business connected with processing agricultural products, and Cindy, she looked at her uncle with different eyes. Banking didn't seem to her to be such a socially useful occupation, unlike manufacturing. Such was her adolescent maximalism, quite different, in her opinion. Nancy was not surprised that Cindy soon wanted to get involved in the business herself. She transferred to correspondence school and became Frank's first assistant, and, a month ago, his wife. The two young families often spent time together, but most of all they liked to get together in the cozy apartment of Evelyn, who never tired of surprising them with her culinary masterpieces. That's what she called the dishes she cooked for her deft pancakes. Her mother, who had visited her sister-in-law. Evelyn no longer needed to work in the factory, but she couldn't sit idle either. Her daughter Cindy set up a cooking blog for her on the internet, and her brother Charles gave her a phone with a powerful camera that she could use to take pictures of the finished dishes and while they were cooking. Evelyn's husband, after surgery and rehabilitation, was now walking confidently, leaning on a cane. Suddenly, he discovered a talent for growing houseplants, and not just flowers, but healthy greens, which his wife used to make salads. "Beloved, I'm home," I heard Nancy's voice, Charles, and hurried down the stairs from the nursery. Once more, he cast a glance at the sleeping baby. Evelyn was coming out of the psychologist's office, wiping her crying eyes. It took her a long time to agree to follow the cardiologist's advice. "I do not believe that heart pain can be caused by psychological problems." "What are you talking about?" "I just got my life back on track," Evelyn assured me. "I don't have any psychological problems." "You're worried about your heart pain. But the examination showed that there is nothing wrong with that organ," the doctor assured her. "That's why I advise you to see a psychologist. It's probably some old trauma, maybe from your childhood." "I do not want to dredge up the past," firmly said Evelyn. "Everything is long forgotten." "Your heart doesn't think so," smiled the doctor. A few days later, when severe heart pains again overtook Evelyn deep into the night, she finally decided to see a psychotherapist, as she was advised by the cardiologist. And what she dreaded happened. She had to talk about her mother, and she didn't want to remember her at all. Insults and pain, she thought, were safely hidden in her heart and did not interfere with life. But in fact, it was time for her heart to get rid of that burden. In the psychologist's office, the girl Evelyn, who had lost her father, who had been burned after the fire, was crying with grief and battle. The unfortunate girl who had never felt her mother's love, and through those tears came relief. She didn't think she could ever forgive her mother, and was surprised at how easy her heart felt when she finally did.